Greetings from the Pacific Northwest in Seattle, Washington. I'm Jason Rigden, and you are listening to the podcast of Mystery, the show that always leaves you with more questions than answers, the podcast where I talk with extraordinary guests about the paranormal, the strange, and the unknown. On this episode, I'll be talking to Dan Shaw about energy vortexes and George Maschke about the pseudoscience of polygraph machines. But first, I just want to remind you about the Mystery Hotline. This is the number to call if you want to tell us about your personal paranormal experiences. The number is 1-888-726-0055. I want to hear about your tales of encounters with Bigfoot, Chupacabra, Mothman, Thunderbirds, the Jersey Devil, and other cryptids. Leave us a message at 1-888-726-0055 with your story, and I will include it on a future episode. I want to hear about your encounters with little green men, tall grays, and those strange, shape-shifting reptilians. So don't hesitate to call 1-888-726-0055 right now and share your story with the listeners of the Podcast of Mystery. Once again, the number for the Mystery Hotline is 1-888-726-0055. I look forward to hearing your voice.
I'm Dan Shaw. I am the Vortex detective, and by vortex, I mean a paranormal place like the Bermuda Triangle. I believe that places themselves have the potential to enhance our psychic abilities and to affect our physiology and the way we think and our spiritual unfoldment.
So how does this work? It's tied to geology? Is it actually the actual place itself, or is it maybe the rocks, or how does the energy kind of work? If you know, I don't know.
Yeah, it's a mystery. It is a mystery. I don't claim to have all the answers, but my own approach is to look first at the simplest, most obvious explanation, which it is the rocks in large part. It's the surface features and subsurface features, which are very rich in components that contribute to the electromagnetic field, components of the electromagnetic field. Our body is electromagnetic. We are not separate from our place, but we're immersed in this churning ocean of electromagnetism. So the way I look at vortexes, it's about our relationship, a relationship of unity, our relationship to our place, and how each affects the other on subtle energy levels, not just electromagnetism, but also all the other types of energies, including consciousness. And I explore those topics at vortexmaps.com.
And so what happens in these vortexes?
I think everyone can relate to the idea of a certain place where they have a certain feeling, places that give us the feels, places that make us feel something, places where we feel elation or dread or whatever the emotion might be, whether it's a mountaintop or some kind of body of water, the desert, whatever it might be for people. There's a profound interaction between our human energy system, the chakras, the aura, however you want to think of that, with the energies of the place. And I do have a background in geography, so I can better understand and explain some of these concepts. And the soil, because it has minerals and water in it, conducts electrical currents. There's electrical currents in the earth. Seawater is not a homogeneous thing, but there are many different compositions of seawater at different depths, temperatures, salinities flowing together, but also with their own unique electromagnetic signatures and interacting. And in the atmosphere, the atmosphere near Earth in which we live, for example, as we change elevation, the electrical potential will change. And then the ionosphere above us in the sun, all these are components of the electromagnetic field that we experience, and I think contribute to our feeling differently in different places. And also, not all psychic experiences, but many psychic experiences may be place related. We think of haunted places like houses or ships or graveyards, battlefields, but places like the Bermuda Triangle that affect us in various ways are everywhere.
And do these places, are there kind of like ever physical manifestations of this energy, or is it more just psychic?
I think every kind of psychic and paranormal experience touches on this idea of paranormal places or vortexes. So uh, we can think of uh, essentially all of these psychic abilities or God powers as being available to us everywhere all the time. But certain places will perhaps enhance or contribute to those experiences, and some of them are natural. Yes, you might go into a cave, uh, as people have done for millennia, for a kind of a vision quest inside the womb of the Mother Earth. Yes, or you might go to a place near you. It doesn't have to be a remote place, but a place near you that is natural and essentially undeveloped and not trodden with and paved, etc. So you might also go to a place that's been intentionally built, some kind of a temple or a monument uh, that um, with the intention of vision questing, touching through to omniscience, to the other side, and the guides and angels, or practicing your psychic abilities, or whatever it is for you, doing some kind of ceremony or ritual, uh, or connecting with the spirits of the place, perhaps, or maybe it's just releasing some grief that's not related to the place per se, but the place itself provides a kind of a nurturing environment, not to mention the pilgrimage to the place, the preparation to go to the place. But those energies at the place, whether they're a kind of a place where the veil between worlds is thin.
And what kind of attracted your interest in these places personally?
Well, it is a long story, but in short, I was already a student of alchemy, by which I mean, by alchemy, I mean not the alchemy of metals per se, but the science of purifying ourselves as the great laboratory or experiment, purifying and perfecting ourselves. I was in Mount Shasta. I was on my way to Lake Tahoe. A person said, "Have you heard about how Shasta's connected to Tahoe?" I said, "No." And they brought out an unpublished book, essentially, uh, that showed a geometric pattern of mountains and bodies of water, 19 mountains and bodies of water around the Grand Tetons. And two of those spots were Shasta and Tahoe. And I saw this map. It looked like a mandala overlaid atop a map of the Western United States. She called it, Dorothy Leon called it the wheel with 19 spokes. And I saw this map and I recognized it as being a very powerful alchemical tool. So the maps themselves also, you'll notice the website is called vortexmaps.com. The places themselves are of tremendous interest, yes, and so are the maps, because it turns out that visionary maps by visionaries of their visions of the earth, are not rare, not rare. So the maps themselves are quite an interesting subject of study, but I'm most interested in using the place as a kind of alchemical tool to transform our physiology, our physical bodies, and also our psyche.
Is it at all possible to kind of maybe replicate's the wrong word, but kind of replicate these vortexes in your own home or in your own like place?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. First, let me give you real on the ground physical sensation, kinesthetic sense of what it's like to go into a vortex, if I may. Although I'm sure you've had many elements of this experience yourself. Sometimes it's a place that you just happen on by accident and it comes at you as a surprise. You round a corner and wow, you're kind of struck by how different it feels from the place you were before, for better or for worse. But often it's a place that you've been thinking of going. It's been calling to you. You kind of carry it around with you. You have a connection to it at a distance, yes? And you make preparations to go there and you clear your schedule and you plan what to bring and what to leave behind. And you anticipate, yes? And whether it's Yosemite Valley or Death Valley or whatever the place may be, Shasta, you travel. There's some hardship involved in travel. You go with a sense of pilgrimage, of seeking something. You arrive at a certain point. You identify that as the threshold, in a certain sense. Here's where I begin to enter into the inner sanctum, and at that point, you pause and you perhaps take off your shoes and go barefoot, or you pay homage to the place and the spirits of the place. And you enter in and you can sense there's a change of energy. The energy changes from meadow to forest, perhaps, but there's an edge, a kind of edge between two bioregions, perhaps, but it's an energetic edge. And you go in and you maybe do nothing in the sense that you sit quietly or you meditate, or maybe you do something active, sing, chant, dance, drum, whatever that is for you. You observe the beauty of the place, the colors, the harmonic proportions, those visual stimuli, the harmonic proportions that you see in the shape of every leaf and plant, they begin to harmonize your brain waves. Yes, you breathe the air. The air has a certain electrical charge in it. Perhaps it's like a waterfall, a lot of negative ions. So you get that breathing in the electrified air. And then you might drink a little water if there's some spring water available that's safe to drink. You might eat a little wild edibles. You might pick up a few pieces of trash. Be there in a sense of gratitude and intention, connect with the place, know that you're not separate from it. And when it's time to go, then to withdraw your energy. Perhaps you've brought some kind of gift. Maybe it's a ribbon or a piece of a little coconut for the squirrels or whatever it is. Something that won't that will biodegrade, yes. And then you withdraw your energy from the place and you bring home the boon. You bring home the gift that that place has given you. Some people sense these energies as a kind of warmth or coolness or tingling, electricity, hot temperature, and pressure, or sometimes a kind of magnetic push-pull. So everybody senses the energies in their own ways. But I think you've had that experience in some degree, way, shape, or form, that there's a place that calls to you, that you go reverently, and that it feeds us and nourishes us. It's totally possible to recreate these vortex energies in your home in a very palpable, real sense. They exist there already. Everywhere the electromagnetic field is varying and it's dynamic, it's changing over time. And your home may appear to be on a featureless, flat plane, maybe a home that's like part of a tract that's built like hundreds of homes the same. But even in that case, your home would have many unique energies to it. Remember, we're talking about not just surface features, but subsurface features. So you may be in a river valley, right? It seems flat and featureless, but underground, very often, a river allowed to flow wild will, it'll thread, it'll braid, it'll fill itself in and change course. And underground, it'll leave oxbow features. And underground, it'll leave varying kinds of deposits, gravel, sand, heavier things like placer gold. These will be deposited in this riverbed. So underground, even if you don't see a lot of changes in elevations and different surface features, you'll still have very interesting electrical conductivity, resistivity, and electrical discontinuities underground, and that'll affect how we feel on the surface, not to mention underground veins of water. So every home has these natural vortex energies to it. And then we've also built the acoustic environment in which we're in. Yes, this resonant cavity, which is our home, often square, rectangular, and filled with stuff. This is an acoustic environment. It has a certain frequency and resonance based on its physical dimensions. And then how you set your furniture, we get into this element that, a very specific kind of geomancy, which is feng shui, this element of this Eastern flavor of, if I can put it that way, of geomancy that is very much focused on flow and the placement of objects. So these things affect the energy in our home itself. Now, I've written a book called Stonehenge Gardening Tips Using Earth Energies in Your Garden. And it answers your question explicitly in several dozen different ways by deconstructing Stonehenge. That's kind of the poster child of ancient monuments, but or as the archetypal or exemplary ancient monument. But every ancient monument is built with a profound understanding of electromagnetic, geophysical energies. In fact, a relatively modern science, geophysics and electromagnetism. These ancient we think, but these ancient monuments are built. They demonstrate a profound understanding of the energies of the earth and the energies of the materials. And in the Stonehenge Gardening Tips book, I look at every different aspect of Stonehenge, the henge itself, which is that circular mound and ditch, the stones, the materials, the geometry, its relationship in a pattern to other places, all the different elements of Stonehenge and how those can be essentially replicated at scale, at a smaller scale, in your own garden. You can build. There's thousands of henges across Britain, the UK, and Europe, and of all different sizes. And just that act of building a little ring and ditch in your garden could have profound implications, or a pyramid in your garden, or home, or business, or land. So yes, building certain things, moving the rocks around, perhaps, building certain things in certain harmonic proportions, geometric shapes, and in certain patterns can replicate vortexes in your home. And the next question, if I can anticipate the mirror image of these vortexes, the kind of the dark side or shadow vortexes, as we call them, vile vortexes. Yes, absolutely possible. One of the principles of alchemy is that anything that can heal can kill. So it may be helpful for you to remember, if you are in a place and you're feeling a little off kilter, nauseous, whatever it might be for you, to be aware that maybe it's the energies of the place itself. And if I just try changing my location, if I move 100 yards in one direction or another, perhaps that'll change what I'm feeling in my body. So to go into these places, maybe, repute, Sedona, it's this healing vortex. You're going to love it, right? But every vortex is going to affect every person differently on every day, according to our own cycles and the cycles of the place. So it's important to go into these places with a self-awareness and not to stay too long if it doesn't feel good for you, for sure. And then there's this element of consciousness. Yes, so while we're putting love energy into the earth grid, while we're at these grid points where churches have been built over ancient monuments or that nobody's ever known about, or in your own backyard, we're putting this love energy in. It's also possible and likely, I think, that there are people and forces who are putting negative energy, so-called loveless energy, so-called negative energy, right, into the grid, control frequencies, if you want to call them that, into the earth grid. So on that level, definitely, I would say it's possible for there to be light vortexes and dark vortexes.
So some of these vortexes may not be entirely natural. Some might be kind of cultivated by like ancient peoples, like maybe like Stonehenge, where people have kind of cultivated that for a long, long time.
Very much so. There's these well-known places with ancient monuments built on them, they've been built up to harness the energy very much like some electrical component, like a capacitor with charge building up and over time and then charge discharging periodically, yes? And then, of course, with these ancient monuments, we also have to look at, they've also been torn down. Stonehenge, Avebury, they were subject to tourists knocking off a little chunk to take home with them and people walking on them, eroding them, and purposefully breaking them up, and other monuments carving crosses into the standing stones, etc. So that energy has been built up, but also co-opted and in some sense torn down and destroyed. Nonetheless, you'll find that once that energy has been built up, on some level, it's there forever. Stonehenge remains in its pristine state on an energetic level, even though the physicality of it has been torn down.
So these places have this energy, and there's kind of the veil between worlds may be thin. There is that true? What I'm kind of wondering is like, and I have a struggle with what to exactly call them, but are these related at all to like aliens and kind of fairies and that kind of thing, of things that seem to be coming here from somewhere else? That might be a little bit too complicated to ask. Sorry.
No, that's great. It's exactly right, really, that these certain places, whether it's Loch Ness or wherever it might be, are associated with crypto creatures, Bigfoot, alien sightings, like I say, almost every type of paranormal experience. So the vortexes touch on fairies, let's say, and on every other type of psychic, or I should say, in this case, perhaps paranormal manifestation. Yeah. And so my job over the last 25 years, in a certain sense, has been steering tightly to that lighthouse, which is the relationship of the paranormal to the place. So yeah, I'm interested in your fairy experience. Where did it happen? Did it follow you around, or does it hang out in this fairy glen? That connection between your paranormal experience and place, and certainly, well, let's say the Montana vortex in Columbia Falls, Montana. Montana Vortex and House of Mystery. It's clearly an electromagnetic vortex for a number of reasons. It's a genuine vortex. I worked there as a tour guide for a number of seasons. Several years back, Joe Hauser bought the Montana Vortex because he is a Bigfoot researcher. And they certainly have orbs manifesting at and around the Montana Vortex. And there have been Bigfoot sightings there and Bigfoot sign as well. And I myself believe that I heard a Bigfoot howl when I was sleeping out at the Montana Vortex. And I've also seen things moved around in private areas in inexplicable ways. So I believe that I do have personal experience with Bigfoot at the Montana Vortex. And of course, it's not, I mean, it's bizarre and unusual, but it's not alone in that these paranormal sightings or psychic sightings do seem correlated with place. And that's what I want to unpack and figure out.
Yeah. So when you are maybe investigating one of these places, or maybe investigating is too harsh a word, like exploring these places, what does that look like? Do you bring any equipment with you? Are you looking for witnesses?
Yes, and yes. I don't look like I'm not outfitted like a ghost hunter exactly. Some people are bringing with them, let's say, dowsing rods or a pendulum. That's a real good way to go to tap into your subconscious. I have a sense of these energies in my own body, but that's been a slow development over time. At first, I felt rather, insensitive to these subtle energies, but with the uh, um, recognition, the awareness that these was a possibility for me to develop these sensitivities over time, I've become more sensitive. And as I said, everybody senses these things differently. Some as heat or cool, some as tingling, a little electrical tingling, some as magnetic push pull. It's different for everybody, different parts of the body. But I tend to sense these things in my hands and in my face, my cheeks, and third eye. So I don't necessarily, I'm not relying on or highly experienced with dowsing rods or pendulum. People can use those techniques. I'm very visual observer, and I'm a close listener, and you can see the movement of the wind. You can see the movement of the water. I do plenty of research from home beforehand. I get those geophysical maps, and I get to see, what is underground at that place, and we can see the surface features. And sometimes you can see the animals behaving strangely, the plants growing differently, and you you feel a change in the air, let's say. So um, probably the most valuable tool in my repertoire would be something like a gravitometer, magnetometer, to actually be able to see at finer resolution what is underground. Um, and a pair of electrodes, or actually two pairs of electrodes, is what the most geophysicists are using today to measure conductivity and resistivity underground. Yeah, so there's some very hard science that you could back it up with. I don't have a magnetometer, that I'm bringing to site, but I get a sense, from the air photos, from the remote sensing data, from what I actually see, sense, and hear and feel on the ground.
And how do you discover these places? Are they just kind of places that are well known to the surrounding community, or are there other ways of discovering these places?
I do a lot of my research right here from home in Southern Oregon, talking to people like you who are experts on their place. An hour north of Mount Shasta, folks are coming through Southern Oregon or the Mount Shasta area. Invite them to get in contact with me. I'll send any listener to your show, I'll send them a free copy of one of my Vortex ebooks. They might want Sedona Vortex Field Guide. They might want Stonehenge gardening tips. Any of the others, I'm happy to send people a free ebook. When they send me an email, I'll answer all emails. So a lot of my research happens just by talking to people. Some spots are, of course, notorious or well known. Other spots you would never even think. It's just a rock in the middle of a stream.
And so it does seem like there are different power levels to them. Like some have more energy.
The most powerful vortex in the world is your own heart. I mean that very, very literally. And yes, there's a unity. These things are all one, they're not separate. And each one has its unique individuality as well. Almost like the energy centers, the chakras in your own body. They're all one, yet they each have their own unique energy. Now, when you visit a vortex, you may find that it does activate or stimulate one particular chakra more than the others. And if you're looking for a certain kind of stimulation, you might go to a certain place because you know that it activates certain kinds of energies. Yeah. And you might also think about all the places in your region, which ones correlate with different chakras. And you might take a chakra activation pilgrimage to a set of 7 of these places, let's say. And just to give an example, in geographic terms, we think of a narrow passage as being a choke point. It's a military strategic point. If ships have to pass through a narrow passage, that's a choke point. That may be associated with your throat chakra, that passage. Yeah. So there's a spot in Yosemite Valley maybe not recollect the name right off the top of my head. This is the name of that spot. It's lovely. Uh, the edge of the valley, there's a bunch of pieces of that granite kind of flaking off. And you just very much get the sense, in some places, there's actually rocks lodged in those cracks. And you very much get the sense of like a mouth or throat with a tongue in it. I did. And it's a place where when I was there, someone was there getting their proposal photos taken. So, the expression of love at this place, which I looked at, and it looks like throats and tongues to me. Here's somebody proposing. Edge of Yosemite Valley. So, different places, once you're aware of the possibility, you'll be able to find those correlations and relationships for yourself. And you can, in a sense, prescribe the vortex for what it is you want.
Are these places at all related to like ley lines?
Lays, technically, is a term for rifle straight alignments of sights, but it's been co-opted. People use the term ley line, and they are using it to describe every type of earth energy line. And if you want to get picky, there are other types of energy lines other than ley lines, but people do use ley lines broadly for any kind of earth energy line. So there's a global scale of ley lines. It's highly geometric. It's called the Earth Grid. And you see, essentially, it's like a spider web or a ball of yarn wrapped around the Earth in this geometric form. And at Vortex Maps, you'll see a version of the Earth Grid, which is the Earth Star, the Becker-Hagen's Earth Star globe. And what you see is that there's these places where these energy lines cross, lays you could call them, or ley lines. And roughly, you could say that where these energy lines cross, that's a vortex. I would agree with that. I wouldn't disagree with it anyway. And we can think of these energy lines very much as the energy meridians in our body. One of the principles of alchemy, as above, so below. The microcosm reflects the macrocosm. So just as our bodies have these chakras or energy centers and these energy channels through them, so does the earth. And not only are they a reflection of each other, they're actually totally integrated in a relationship of unity.
So these places have, this energy and kind of this spiritual meaning, it seems, and helps your consciousness. I'm wondering, when I visit these places, or maybe when a listener visits places, should they be doing anything to take any kind of precautions? Like, sometimes in spiritual practices, you should do some kind of precautions to protect yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if listeners feel that what they like is to do a little psychic self-defense, I would refer them to my friend and mentor, Roger Armstrong's website, which I've helped him develop, which is called Was a Psychic Child, wasapsychicchild.com. So if you're a psychic child, you'd like help developing your psychic abilities, especially spiritual self-defense, I would recommend that. When I go to these places, I invite in my guides and angels and the spirits of the place. I'm not a big fan of going to graveyards and battlefields and hospitals and such. Just like I don't like to mess with class 4 rapids. I don't feel that I have that clarity of psychic sight to go in there like that on some kind of relief mission exactly. But wherever I find myself, I invoke my guides and angels. And I like to think that if there's any dark forces around, they're here to learn about love.
My gosh, we've kind of blown through our time together. I just kind of wonder. I was kind of wondering also, just maybe one last question before we sum it up. Like, do you have any particularly favorite places? Any places that are like really, really connected to you?
Sure. We all do. And for me, one of those places is Lake Tahoe. I spent a lot of summers there as a kid growing up. I carry it with me. I'm not separate from Lake Tahoe. When I stand at Mount Shasta and I look towards the center of that wheel with 19 spokes, what I call the Earth Star North America, which is the other map that I published at vortexmaps.com. When I stand at Shasta and look essentially towards the center of the circle, the Grand Tetons, I can very strongly ground and orient myself to all those other points on that wheel with 19 spokes. So I feel a profound connection where I am now, even north of Mount Shasta, with that other point on the wheel with Lake Tahoe. And have been fortunate to do some traveling, not as much as I'd like, but visited a few foreign countries, and every single one, of course, I want to go back. I feel deeply connected to. There's a tree at the Montana Vortex I named Sophie, and I miss Sophie.
Yeah, I kind of relate to that. I think of different places. It is strange how you can have a relationship with a particular tree. I know that's hard to explain maybe to people that haven't had that, but once you really know a tree, it's strange. It's a being that's probably going to outlive you. It's been here longer than you, and it's also like so connected to the place. Sorry for the little tangent there, but I do love trees.
That was totally on point.
If people want to learn more about these vortexes, more about you, where should they go?
Visit me at vortexmaps.com or danshaw.com. Send me an email, ask at danshaw.com. When you send me an email, I'll send you a free Vortex ebook, and I'll answer every email. And happy to look at it where your place is on the map. I do that kind of work always by donation. I have a couple of maps and a number of books. Another one coming out any day now, which will be called Visionary Maps, which will actually be broader than, it'll be more inclusive than the narrow topic of vortex maps. So I keep putting out the work, and thanks in very large part to folks like you, just everyday folks out there who are sharing with me about their special places.
Well, thank you so much for sharing this with us, and thank you so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it.
Right back at you, Jason. Keep up the good work. Can you turn back on the recording for a second?
Oh, sure. Actually, yes, we're still going. Yeah, because
Are we?
Yeah, because Zoom does the thing. Oh, I suppose I can. Yeah.
I would love to just take a second to unpack the landscape of Seattle a little bit.
Yeah.
Seattle has a fascinating geophysics to it. And as I say, I lived in the area for about a year and a half. The landscape is very much a glacial landscape. Yes, you've got all these features, such as lakes, which are essentially just the remains of the glacial age. And during the time of the glaciers, the glaciers would have been like mile thick, just massive weight of this ice sheet on the continent. As that ice melted, then over time, the landscape underneath actually rebounds and lifts back up when all that pressure is released. So ordinarily in the geophysics and the monuments, when we unpack them from an electromagnetic standpoint, we've got stones that are under compression. Yes, and under compression, quartz crystal is piezoelectric. But also with Yosemite Valley, you've got this granite, which is essentially rebounding. It's coming back from the weight of having all those glaciers on it. In the Seattle area, of course, you've got Mount Rainier, where a UFO was sighted by a pilot, and that's where we get the word UFO, over Mount Rainier. So that is a very energetic spot. It's one of those mountains that's on that wheel with 19 spokes. And then in downtown Seattle, you have Green Lake. Yeah, there's that park around Green Lake. It's like this spot that was so nice that it was not developed. And there's a number of vortexes I think you'll find around that Green Lake area there. And then, of course, as you get out into the Puget Sound, on some level, you have this mythological aspect of the sound itself being like a yoni or a vagina, yeah, with that island coming into it, almost like a penis coming into the sound. So you have that going on. You've got a very interesting spot out there in the islands called Deception Pass. And that's a interesting kind of a vortex, yes. And then, of course, anywhere you get an island, it's essentially a vortex. It's an electromagnetic anomaly, or it's different from the surrounding area there. So just like any place, I have a particular love for Seattle, but Seattle is replete with what I call components of the vortex effect.
Yeah, you definitely, when you get out of Seattle and you start talking to people who, have lived in the area for a long time, there's all kinds of stories about special spots and like seeing things and sacred things that only the little local people know about. It's always very interesting to get out there and actually ask people, well, what have you seen? What's weird out here?
Yep. Well, I'd very much like to look you up when I get into the area. And if you need suggestions for folks to speak on your shows, Roger Armstrong would be a great one. And I've got many other suggestions for guests.
Yeah. I'm always looking for guests, as we're kind of building this rickety ship. We'll see.
Well, I'm sure glad you are. I'm sure glad you found me, and vice versa.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was just absolutely fascinating. I really, really appreciate it. And just really enjoy and appreciate our time together, that sharing this story and this information. The Podcast of Mystery is a one-man operation. There is no network or multinational conglomerate behind me. It's just me, a guy with a microphone and a few questions. I book the guests, I do the research, I do the interviews, and I edit and master the audio. It's all me. But there is something I need help with: marketing. If you enjoy this show, would you please consider telling folks about the Podcast of Mystery on social media? I don't have the money to buy ads, so I'm really depending on my listeners to help spread the word on social media. So if you want to help this show grow, would you please help people discover the Podcast of Mystery by sharing a favorite episode on social media? I really need your help to get the show off the ground. It doesn't matter if you have 100,000 followers or just a dozen. Every single social media post promoting this show matters. So please do me a favor here and post something about the Podcast of Mystery on social media and help spread the word about the show. We are Pod of Mystery on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok.
My name is George Maschke, and I'm a co-founder of antipolygraph.org, which is a nonprofit public interest website dedicated to exposing and ending waste, fraud, and abuse associated with the use of polygraphs and other purported lie detectors. My interest in polygraphy really began when, during an FBI pre-employment polygraph some 25 years ago, I was falsely accused of lying about matters concerning national security. So the polygraph operator basically accused me of being a spy. He said I showed deception when denying having provided classified information to anyone unauthorized to receive it, when I denied having unauthorized contacts with a representative of a foreign government. And I think the other one was when I denied that anyone had directed me to seek FBI employment. Of course, I answered all those questions truthfully, but I ended up being branded as a liar and barred for life from FBI employment. So I was a graduate student at UCLA at the time, so I went to the research library and read everything I could learn about polygraphs and quickly discovered that it's pseudoscience. Yet it's deeply entrenched in American pop culture. And regrettably, the other big user of the polygraph is the United States government, as well as state and local governments. I like to call it the official pseudoscience of the United States government.
And for our listeners that aren't familiar, how do these polygraphs kind of work?
Well, so the idea is that if there's a change in your breathing rate or in your heart rate or blood pressure or in the amount of palmar sweating that can be measured with electrodes on your fingertips, that means you're lying. And it's a simplistic assumption that is sometimes right, sometimes wrong. In any event, the procedure used has no grounding in the scientific method. And it's in addition to often branding truthful people as liars. There are also ways that liars can game the system to pass or to increase their chances of passing despite lying. So it's a pseudoscience that shouldn't be relied on for any serious public purpose, including, for example, claims whether someone has been abducted by aliens or whether they saw a UFO. And for the benefit of your audience, I could mention I believe there are such things as unidentified flying objects. That doesn't mean they're necessarily from outer space or the product of extraterrestrials.
And how long have these polygraph tests been around?
Well, 2021 marks the centenary of the assembly of the first polygraph instrument. It was put together by a officer on the Berkeley, California Police Department, who was also a medical student at the University of California at Berkeley. So he was looking at articles published by William Moulton Marston, who had developed a lie test based simply on a blood pressure cuff. And he would monitor someone's blood pressure while asking a series of questions and attempting to determine whether or not that person was telling the truth or not. And but it just had one component, the blood pressure cuff. So John Larson, the police officer at the Berkeley Police Department, had the idea to attach also a pneumograph, which would measure one's breathing as well as heart rate. And in later years, a third component, a galvanic skin response measure or electrodermal response gauge, which are the electrodes that go on the fingertips, was also added to the polygraph instrument.
It seems for me, as someone who's kind of a high anxiety person, that there's no way I would ever pass a polygraph. I'm just casually talking to you and I have sweaty palms right now.
Well, it's true that being nervous adversely affects your chances of passing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll fail. There's we might as well get right into it and discuss the dirty little secret behind the polygraph. This is information the public is not supposed to know, that virtually no polygraph operator will ever tell you. But very early on, polygraph operators realized that truthful, innocent people also come in nervous. And if they're asked, did you rob the bank? Even if they didn't, they might still, their heart might race, they might sweat more, their breathing might be affected. So what they do is they compare your reactions to what are called relevant questions, like, did you rob the bank? Do you know who robbed the bank? Do you know where any of the money is? To your reactions when you answer what are called control or comparison questions. And these are questions that they secretly assume that everyone is going to lie to. They want you to lie to them. These are questions, for example, did you ever lie to a person in a position of authority? And they'll explain to you during the pre-test phase of the polygraph before they even hook you up. So we want to know, are you the kind of person who would rob the bank and then lie to the police? So I'm going to ask you, did you ever lie to a person in a position of authority? And you could answer that question, no, couldn't you? And in this situation, most people will say no, but it's secretly assumed that everyone has lied to someone in a position of authority, whether it's a parent, a teacher, a minister, a Boy Scout leader, and so forth. And so what they'll do is they'll compare your reactions to that control question with your reactions to the relevant question, like, did you rob the bank? Do you know who robbed the bank? And if you react more strongly to the control question, then they assume you're innocent, you're telling the truth when you deny having robbed the bank. But if the question about robbing the bank still bothers you more than the question about lying to someone in authority, which it often might, because the answer to one question might send you to jail, whereas the other won't, then you fail the test. So if this methodology seems simplistic to you, that's because it is. It has no grounding in the scientific method. And it's also vulnerable to simple countermeasures that anyone can learn and that polygraph operators cannot detect. So, as you'll surmise, the keys to passing is to show stronger reactions to the control questions than to the relevant questions. And say you rob the bank and the money is hidden in your mattress. You can, when asked the control question, simply pick an arbitrarily large number, say 973, and in your head count backward by sevens as fast as you can. And that will produce the same sort of reaction that they expect to see from someone who is lying or having trouble with a question. It's disturbing them. And as simple as that, you can beat the polygraph. So whether someone fails or passes, you really can't be confident that it indicates they're telling the truth or not. Many Americans are under the misimpression that the polygraph, it's not perfect, it's not completely reliable. Maybe it can't be admitted as evidence in court, but it still has some sound scientific basis. It really doesn't. It's complete pseudoscience. It's in the same category as phrenology and haruspicy, which was an ancient Roman practice of divination where they'd slaughter an animal and a qualified examiner would examine its entrails and predict the future for such important things as the outcome of battles. And unfortunately, our government uses the polygraph as the oracle of truth to determine who's a spy and who isn't, who gets hired, who doesn't, who keeps their security clearance, who doesn't. In the case of people on probation or parole, it may determine whether they get sent to jail or are allowed to continue on parole. In terms of criminal interrogations, while the polygraph is not admissible, the results are not admissible in the courtroom, anything said in the polygraph suite is admissible. And so the polygraph is often used to put psychological pressure on a suspect. The subject failing the polygraph might be a part of the interrogation plan. That is a scripted outcome that's going to happen no matter what the charts show. He'll be told he failed, and then they go for a confession or some sort of inculpatory statement from the suspect. So if any of your listeners are ever asked by the police to take a polygraph, they should say no, and they should immediately seek legal counsel. Because if you're asked to take a polygraph, it's not that the police want your help in solving a crime. You're a suspect, and you need a lawyer.
Yeah, to all my listeners, never talk to the cops without your lawyer. I mean, any lawyer will tell you that. You got to have a lawyer. So at what point, like how early was the polygraph recognized as pseudoscience by the rest of the scientific community?
Pretty much immediately, because it never gained acceptance by the scientific community. In fact, in the mid-1920s, the Supreme Court recognized that the lie detector was not recognized by the scientific community in a case called, it's called the Fry case. And I forget, was it the U.S. against Fry? Or I think it was Fry versus the United States, possibly. Anyway, so a man named Fry in Washington, D.C. was charged with murder. And he had a lie detector test with the earlier inventor I mentioned to you, William Moulton Marston, who had the lie detector that only had the blood pressure cuff. And so Marston tested Fry and said that, well, Fry's telling the truth. He passed my test. And Fry wanted that evidence introduced at trial. And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court rejected the lie detector, not just Marston's one measurement lie detector test, but the polygraph as well. And for close to 70 years, that was a prevailing standard for polygraph admissibility in most in all federal courts and in most state courts. There's a newer standard in federal courts and also adopted by many state courts called the Daubert standard. Under that standard, actually, a judge might decide to allow polygraph testimony, but that would be after hearings about whether it should be admitted or not. And in practice, polygraph testimony is rarely admitted, whether in criminal or actually almost never in criminal. Where it is sometimes admitted is in civil litigation, but that's also rare.
So it seems like the federal courts have recognized that, this polygraph stuff is pseudoscience. Why is it that there's these federal agencies that have still continued to use it, despite knowing for almost 100 years that it's not a thing?
Well, the reason seems to be that from a very early time, actually from 1921, when the polygraph was first devised, journalists started, credulously reporting on it as if it was some magical device that would determine whether someone has spoken the truth. And so very quickly, a mythology rose around the polygraph that, it can read your mind. And Hollywood movies perpetuated the myth. So many Americans came to believe that the polygraph worked. And because of that, under the polygraph, many people will admit things that they might not if there wasn't a polygraph there. So for security managers, even those who might recognize that it's not reliable from a scientific standpoint, they still find it useful for getting admissions. And the other problem is because it originated with the police and spread quickly among them, there's a problem in law enforcement, which is most police officers don't have a strong background in science. And so many became convinced that it really worked. And people who became polygraph operators would find people would make amazing confessions to them. So many of them also came to believe that they can really tell whether someone is lying or not. You see, when they're wrong, they usually don't find out about it. For example, say they falsely accuse an innocent person of lying. Well, most of the time, they'll never know for sure that that person was really innocent. And when they get beaten, well, they usually will never find that out either.
It seems like it's a very familiar kind of shell game you see in pseudoscience, where with this idea of that, one, it's a prop for the interrogation to help get a confession or to intimidate people, but then it's still used, it seems to be, still believed to actually be some sort of divination tool to determine deception. So it's this thing, it seems like they'll use, depending on which will benefit them, that will be the excuse they'll use about why they're using it, if that's not too many words.
Yeah, there are people who have had their probation revoked and been sent to jail because they failed the polygraph. There are people who have lost their jobs because they failed the polygraph. So various federal, state, and local government agencies do actually put credence in the chart readings produced by the polygraph operators, and they are no more valid than astrological chart readings.
So when someone comes to you and says that they have had a polygraph test. Maybe it is an extraordinary event like an alien abduction, or maybe it's regarding some kind of criminal or civil case. What's your reaction when they tell you, well, I passed a polygraph test?
Well, people usually don't contact me when they've passed a polygraph test. At antipolygraph.org, we usually hear from people who have failed one. But when I see in the media, for example, in television, newspapers, that someone has passed a polygraph test, well, what that usually says to me is that they're doing it as a public relations ploy. This might happen, for example, in the case of a politician who's been accused of some sexual impropriety, sexual harassment, for example. He'll take a polygraph, and of course, these polygraphs will be arranged by the person's lawyer. If they fail, you'll never hear about it. The only result that will ever be made public is the good news that the client passed the polygraph, and it's used for perception management, public relations. In terms of claims of alien abduction where people have passed a polygraph, I haven't heard of the polygraph used in such claims in recent years, but I think more like in the last century, like 70s, 80s, maybe 90s, such polygraphs having been done, which was before I became involved in polygraph-related activism. So those I really don't put any stock in. The fact that someone passed a polygraph isn't dispositive of anything. It doesn't even tell you that the person believes what they were saying, just that their reactions to the control questions were stronger than their reactions to the relevant questions, which could be for any number of reasons. It's not a scientific test. It doesn't tell us anything that we wouldn't know without the polygraph.
Do you have any thoughts about other forms of detecting deception? A few years ago, it was very popular. There are several books about, how you could tell from someone's body language if they were telling the truth or not, or how many times they blinked. Is that still in that same kind of continuum of the pseudoscience?
Yeah, that's pseudoscience too. There is no scientific method of lie detection that has yet been devised. It's all quackery being marketed by hucksters who are out to make a buck from gullible people.
So with all these agencies and even police departments using it, do you think that these lie detectors are kind of a threat to our security, specifically thinking about like the CIA and the FBI using it? If it's not reliable, is that dangerous for us?
Yes, it is. And for two reasons. First, is the honest people who are falsely accused of deception, which deprives the government of qualified, talented potential employees that end up being, in many cases, barred for life, like with a federal agency. If you fail their polygraph, like with the FBI, you're barred for life. You'll never be qualified to work for the FBI ever again. And that accusation that you lied on the polygraph will be shared with other federal agencies, which will make your chances of getting hired with them also more difficult. So there's the loss of qualified talent. And then because the test first doesn't work, but second is vulnerable to effective countermeasures that the polygraph operators cannot detect, it also means that foreign spies, for example, can easily fool the polygraph. And to the extent that the government relies on polygraph outcomes, it's undermining national security. A good example, perhaps many of your listeners will be familiar with, is the case of Aldrich Ames, who was a CIA counterintelligence officer, intelligence officer, but he recruited Russian spies. He worked counterintelligence, and in the 1980s, he decided to become a spy for the Russians. He volunteered, volunteered his services to them. And during his career as a spy against the United States, he passed 2 polygraph screenings. Meanwhile, other innocent employees came under suspicion. So the polygraph actually shielded Ames and helped to prolong his career as a spy against the United States. And he's hardly alone in having fooled the polygraph. The Defense Intelligence Agency's top analyst for Cuban affairs was a Cuban spy. She had been volunteered her services to Cuba before she even applied to work with the Defense Intelligence Agency. She had visited Cuba, where they trained her how to beat the polygraph. And during her Defense Intelligence Agency employment, she did exactly that. And so she was finally captured, no thanks to the polygraph, but through an informant from Cuban intelligence who tipped off the United States. She was identified as a spy, eventually arrested, and she's in jail now. But there are also numerous other examples I could cite. It's been reported that at one point, basically all of the CIA's Cuban recruits were actually double agents working against the CIA, and they all beat the polygraph.
Is there any interest federally, like either through executive action or through legislation, to kind of curb this use?
No, not at all. If anything, so there was some interest in 20 years ago. The Department of Energy decided to require polygraph screening of scientists and engineers who were working on atomic weapons. This happened after the case of Wen Ho Lee, who was suspected of having provided classified weapons design information to China. Actually, there was no evidence that he did that. And after he was detained in horrible conditions for a long time, he was eventually released on a plea agreement to mishandling some classified information that he had to do with backup tapes that he had made. And the judge actually apologized to him for the way he had been treated. But nonetheless, the Department of Energy decided that they should go ahead and require these scientists and engineers to submit the polygraph screening. And, these were smart people who realized that the polygraph was nonsense. And so the New Mexico senators, so two of the major labs were in New Mexico, Los Alamos National Laboratory and Sandia National Laboratories, they prevailed upon Congress to appropriate money so that the National Academy of Sciences could do a review of the scientific evidence on the polygraph. And they did. And they found that the reliability of the polygraph was insufficient to justify its use for screening federal employees and applicants. And nonetheless, right around the time that report came out, while it was still, the study was still underway, 9/11 happened, and any concern about science got swept under the rug. And so since that report came out, well, what happened is the federal agencies that rely on polygraph screening completely disregarded it. And instead of getting rid of the polygraph, they doubled down on it, actually tripled down. The number of polygraph screenings skyrocketed, and it's at all-time highs now in the federal government. So at no point in American history has governmental reliance on the polygraph been greater than now.
And I read stories that they use these polygraph tests on suspected terrorists. That seems incredibly dangerous to me because if it's not reliable, you might as well just do their astrological chart and then base your actions on that. Are they still doing that with terrorists?
Well, exactly. Yes, they are. And as well as informants. So one FBI informant, which I'm trying to remember his full name, his last Emad, E-M-A-D, Salem, S-A-L-E-M, was an informant for the FBI. And he knew the people who perpetrated the first bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993, that was a truck bomb driven into the cellar of one of the towers, and it killed, I think, about 7 people, injured many more, caused a lot of damage. An informant whose information might have prevented that bombing was terminated by the FBI because he hadn't passed a polygraph test. They immediately brought him back after the bombing. But this is the sort of harm that misplaced reliance on polygraphy can and has caused to national security.
So you are an expert on these polygraph tests. Is there anything that I should have asked you that maybe I missed during our conversation here?
Well, I should say I'm reluctant to qualify myself as an expert because I'm not a scientist. I do have a background. I'm a former U.S. Army interrogator, former U.S. Army Reserve Intelligence Officer. But my area of expertise is Middle Eastern languages. I'm an Arabic linguist and a Persian linguist. But I've read a lot of the scientific literature on polygraphs. It's not, as the late David T. Licken, who wrote what is really I think the authoritative book on polygraphy, called A Tremor in the Blood, Uses and Abuses of the Polygraph. What he said about polygraphy is that it's not rocket science. In fact, it's not science at all. So you needn't be a scientist to understand it. We've at antipolygraph.org, my co-founder and I have written a book that's intended for a more general audience, particularly for people who might face polygraph screening at some point. It's called The Lie Behind the Lie Detector. And it will tell you in more layman's terms what the scientific shortcomings of the polygraph are. It explains in more detail than we were able to go through for this podcast of polygraph methodology. There's additional types of questions in addition to relevant and controlled questions that we go into there. And we also explain in great detail how to pass or beat the polygraph, not because we want to help spies, terrorists, saboteurs, or sex offenders to fool the polygraph, but because many honest, truthful people are compelled to submit to polygraph testing, and they face a very serious risk of being falsely accused of being liars and suffering serious adverse consequences on that account. So we base what we write on the published literature, both scientific as well as U.S. government documentation, which we've been able to obtain sometimes through Freedom of Information Act requests, sometimes through leaks. Anyway, we've got a lot of information. If any of your listeners would like to know more about polygraphs, they can go to antipolygraph.org. They'll find probably more than they want to know there.
And are there any kind of other organizations or groups where people can get involved and help, end this kind of pseudoscience?
Well, we're trying to coordinate that to the extent we can. As you might understand, many people who are subject to polygraphy are reluctant to speak out publicly. For example, if you're interested in working in the intelligence field, if you speak out publicly against the polygraph, it's going to make it very hard for you to get a job in that field. I was still a reserve intelligence officer when I started antipolygraph.org. And shortly after I did that, my security clearance was revoked in apparent retaliation for that. Yeah, so there's a price to that. But so other than our antipolygraph.org, I don't know of any organization that's really focusing on polygraph policy reform. The ACLU has a good attitude toward the polygraph issue. They understand its shortcomings and are against polygraph screening. we've got proposed legislation on antipolygraph.org to reform federal law to outlaw it completely from the American workspace. I also think it should be actually eliminated from police departments as well for criminal interrogations because of the potential, the well-documented potential for abuse in interrogation. Many people have falsely confessed after being interrogated, after being accused of having failed the lie detector, and based on the false confessions, spent years in jail, only to be exonerated later, thanks to DNA evidence. But certainly there must be others who were never exonerated because DNA evidence wasn't available. So yeah, I think the polygraph should be scrapped for all purposes. So we're holding periodic meetups now online that anyone is welcome to join if they feel compelled to get involved. One can write to one's elected representatives. Right now, though, I think there's too few of us, too far spread out in various jurisdictions, that it's hard to get the topic of polygraph policy onto any politician's radar.
Do you have any thoughts about why are they so protective of this? Like it almost seems like there was a blacklist where, as soon as you started talking about it, then, like you said, there was maybe a retaliation. It's a bit of work to do to protect something like this.
Yeah, well, I guess because they value it as an interrogation tool, and that depends on people not knowing that it's nonsense. So much so, for example, there's a former police polygraph operator who realized what he was doing was wrong. And he started campaigning against it in 1970s, actually 1979. His name is Doug Williams. He has a website since 1996 called polygraph.com. And for a fee, he would teach people in person how to pass or beat the polygraph. And federal law enforcement agencies targeted him for entrapment and imprisonment around 2012. And eventually he was criminally charged based solely on his having trained two undercover agents how to pass the polygraph. And he spent 2 years in federal prison for that. So, it's tremendous federal resources were spent to prosecute him, as well as another man who had no special experience or knowledge about polygraphs. He had just bought Doug Williams' manual and was set up a website and was teaching people how to pass the polygraph. He was also targeted for entrapment, and he spent, I think, was sentenced to 8 months. He took a plea deal. And I think they probably targeted me too. It's hard to be certain, but something very suspicious happened that I've written about on antipolygraph.org. If you go to antipolygraph.org and you use the site's search field and search for an attempted entrapment, you'll find that story. It's very fishy. I received an email in the Persian language purporting to be someone in Iraq who said they were a member of an Islamic group and they were seeking to restore freedom to Iraq. And the police were suspicious of this person and wanted them to take a lie detector test. And could I please help them? And it seemed to me like they were like an attempt to set me up for material support to terrorism charge. It's hard to be sure. But anyway, I've documented that with the email I received. You can see the text, and I translated it from Persian to English and documented everything. It sure looks suspicious. And then a few months later, I heard from a Navy petty officer who said he had gone for his polygraph screening test, and he was confronted in the polygraph suite with a printout of the websites he had visited the night before, and antipolygraph.org was on the list. And he said that this was, he thought constitutionally it was problematic, and he said he would, be in touch further after work. He was on his way to work. And then I never heard from him again, and he didn't respond to emails. And when I eventually called him a couple of months later, when he heard me recognize my voice, he hung up. So it sounded like he had received a talking to. So it made me wonder, is the site under surveillance or not? I'm not a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist, but this certainly seemed suspicious to me. And
you are talking about, the CIA and FBI and military intelligence and stuff. I mean, they do stuff.
Well, yeah, and 2013 was the year that Edward Snowden revealed to us some of the extent of that surveillance. It was quite expansive.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. And also thank you for all the work you're doing to kind of educate people about this issue. It's very fascinating, and I'm still perplexed about why it's still being used. It just drives me crazy.
Well, me too.
So if people wanted to learn more about you and your work, where should they go?
Okay, well, they can go to antipolygraph.org. Basically, everything I have to say or have written about polygraphy is there. We do have a YouTube channel as well. It's Antipolygraph. We're on Twitter at AP_org. If you want to know more about me in particular and the experience that led me to co-found antipolygraph.org, if you go to our personal statement section, which you'll find on the navigation bar, the third statement is my own.
All right. I'll make sure I have all those links in the show notes. Once again, thank you so much for your time and for coming on and telling us all about the pseudoscience behind polygraphs.
It's been a pleasure speaking with you, Jason.
I'm Jason Rigden, and you've been listening to episode number 11 of the podcast A Mystery. If you want more information about me, the show, or my guests, please visit podcastofmystery.com. If you have a guest or a topic that you would like to hear on this show, please email podofmystery@gmail.com. You can also send any feedback or comments to that same address. This audio program has been copyrighted by me, Jason Rigden, in 2021, and is freely available under the Creative Commons Attribution License.